It's been 1 week since the Euros final, and ever since, Britain has been in the grip of a new moral panic over racist football fans. After it was revealed that the mural of Marcus Rashford in Manchester had been sprayed with graffiti after Rashford missed his penalty in that clash with Italy, the media has done little else but whip up a frenzy around what a racist cesspit England has become. But now, it turns out this graffiti on Rashford's mural wasn't racist after all. And Greater Manchester Police have themselves said that while the graffiti may have been rude and juvenile, it wasn't racially motivated. And as my guest Brendan O'Neill has pointed out in his recent article for Spiked Online, this is an important indicator that the past week of fury over racist football fans has been motivated more by hysteria than facts. Brendan writes, what this all suggests is that the discussion about racism today is becoming more and more unhinged, more and more disconnected from reality. There is no evidence that the anti-Rashford graffiti was racist, and yet anti-racist protests against it. Surveys and polls continually show that Britain has become less racist in recent decades, and yet the cultural elites have convinced themselves that racism lurks everywhere. Racism, Brendan O'Neill says, has become a moral panic. And Brendan joins me now. And Brendan, look, I know that neither you or me are saying that there wasn't some racist abuse from within the UK towards those players who took the penalties. But it's all about relativity, isn't it? And if you switched on the BBC or ITV or Sky News over the past week, you would believe that there were literally thousands and thousands of racist England football fans heaping abuse on these poor young lads. And in fact, that's not the case, is it? And when it comes to the Rashford mural, Greater Manchester Police seem to suggest this was about, you know, intra-club rivalry between Man City and Man United.
Yeah, none of it stacks up at all. And as you say, all of us deplore the racist abuse that was aimed at Saka and Sancho and Rashford, you know, really, really horrible stuff. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of that came from overseas. The stuff that came from the UK, it was very small in number. That's not to say it wasn't horrible and offensive and hurtful to the individuals who received it. But it's important that we don't blow it out of proportion. It's important that we don't hold it up as proof that the whole country is racist and that England hasn't progressed at all in terms of its social attitudes. So it was the transformation of those horrible instances of racial abuse into a moral panic about racism. That's the thing that worried me. And I thought that the Rashford mural really summed this up, because for a whole week, people just presumed that was a racially motivated attack on the Rashford mural, but it seems that it wasn't. So all those protests and all that screeching and wailing over this racist assault, it all turns out to have been for nothing. So we really need to get a grip in the discussion about racism.
Well, we do, because what shocked me so much is when the BBC themselves actually analysed where these Instagram posts towards the three players you mentioned, Saka, Sancho and Rashford, had come from. They could only prove that 5 of the racist remarks were from within the UK. So, yeah, of course, go and arrest those 5 people. Let them feel the full force of the law. And that is absolutely what the police are doing. But this is not a widespread issue. And I'm sorry, if you were just stumbling upon the media coverage, that's not what you would believe.
That's exactly right. And this is the problem I think we face in the early 21st century in the UK. There are large numbers of people, noisy people in the media, in activist circles, who are determined to present us as a horrible racist country with a horrible racist past, full of horrible racist people. And that is just not most people's experience of this country. This is actually a very positive country for ethnic minority people to live in. It's arguably the least racist country in Europe. We've made massive leaps forward in terms of racial equality over the past 5 or 6 decades. All that stuff should be celebrated. I think it's wonderful, personally speaking, but we have this misanthropic, depressing view of the country as a racist hellhole. And I think what's happening is that the woke elites, or however we want to refer to them, they now use the issue of racism as a way of looking down their noses at ordinary people. Talking about racism has become a way of morally distinguishing yourself from the plebs. So there is this assumption that working class football fans are racist, and there are racists in working class communities, especially those that voted for Brexit. It's become its own form of prejudice. That's the tragedy of what's happened to so-called anti-racism today. It's a way for the elites to distance themselves from ordinary people. That's what we've seen over the past week. We've seen the weaponization of anti-racism to the end of demonizing ordinary people and puffing up the woke elites who now pose as the moral saviors of the nation.
And what I found so sad about it, Brendan, is it meant that immediately all of that goodwill and unity that had formed throughout England as a result of the Euros was immediately wiped out within 24 hours. It's like the media didn't want to celebrate that English unity. And that made me so sad, because I think back to the 2012 Olympics when it was all about Team GB, and we rode that wave of positivity for some time, and the country was in a good place and felt very united. But it was as if the media wanted to stamp down on that positivity immediately.
Yeah, it didn't last long at all, did it? You know, there was all that talk about being in it together and the nation pulling together behind the England team. And there was a lot of that going on. I watched most of the games in pubs, and there was a huge sense of unity between ordinary people, a sense that we were about to come out of lockdown, hopefully, that we were pulling together, we were heading towards a new future, the team were doing really well. There was a sense of positivity, but it collapsed very quickly after the final, because the culture warriors of the regressive elites, they said, actually, we've changed our minds. We don't think the country is a fair, nice country after all. We don't think they're all like following in the footsteps of Gareth Southgate. Actually, we're going to go into our old mold of looking upon this country as a racist, horrible place. So we've sunk back into their culture war narrative. And that's really, really depressing, because there was a moment of unity. There was a moment where people were bonded by national solidarity, national identity, not the racial identities we are constantly implored to wrap ourselves in. This was a national moment. This was a moment of people coming together across communities. But it was destroyed by the moral panic over racism, the return of identity politics, and this insistence that actually the country hasn't improved at all. So I think the whole thing has demonstrated, firstly, that ordinary people really do long for a sense of national solidarity, but that there are sections of the elites who are determined to drag on this identitarian warfare without realizing how destructive it can be.
And Brendan, there was huge snobbery and elitism around lots of the coverage, and I think so much of it comes back to the fact that our elite fundamentally look down their noses at football fans. And I thought a great example of this was the idiot who had the flare up his bum. But if you read many of the papers and if you watch a lot of the broadcasts, you would believe that this bloke, rather than being a one-off idiot, was indicative of all England football fans.
Exactly right. And firstly, you would have thought he was symbolic of all fans, as you say, but also he was held up as proof as to why we can't get back to normal after the pandemic. Because lots of commentators and broadcasters were saying, you know, Boris Johnson wants us to trust ordinary people to make their own judgments about whether to wear masks and whether to socially distance. But look at this idiot with a flare up his bum. This proves what English people are really like. So it was held up as, firstly, as proof that football fans are all a bunch of marauding idiots. And secondly, that the vast majority of the public cannot be trusted to know the best way to organise their lives. So a complete outburst of snobbery, really ugly snobbery. You know, everyone knows it's not a good idea to put a flare up your bum. I'm sure the guy who does it knows as well. You know, this was such a ridiculous moment to turn into a national symbol. But they did that because that's really how they view ordinary people. And that's especially how they view working class football fans. They think they are a bunch of idiots. They think they're a destructive mob. So the snobbery that we've seen over the past week or so has also been depressing, because it's a reminder that we're not all in it together, and there are still some sections of society that look down their noses on the rest of us.
No, totally. And it's very ironic, of course, because any time there's protests, violent protests at a cause that the mainstream media support. So, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests or the Extinction Rebellion protests, they do the exact opposite. They tell us to ignore the minority of people that are being violent or are being idiots. But in this case, they wanted to amplify them. But look, Brendan, let me bring in my panel. We have comedian Abby Roberts here today, the author and journalist Amy Nicol, and the political commentator Dominique Samuels. Amy, is there anything that Brendan said that you want to pick up on or challenge him on?
What Brendan said was fabulous, but I just love the fact that he's unbuttoned 2 buttons on the shirt, because it shows a confident man.
It's a Sunday night.
I just trust you. I'm like, say whatever you want. I feel safe in your hands.
Okay, I'll leave you two to have that conversation after the show, but let's bring it back to football.
Get a room.
Sorry. I had a boyfriend called Brendan and another one called Neil, and whenever I hear Brendan O'Neill, I think of the both. And that's but big topic. And Abby,
where's this going?
What do you think?
Thanks, Abby. Anyway, I've said something inappropriate. Now it's your turn. Okay, Brendan. Hello, my darling. We haven't actually met, but I have written for Spiked, and I love it. Anyway, let's get that out of the way. I just wanted to ask you whether you think that the solution to a lot of the woke stuff that we're seeing might lie in the hands of Conservatives with a small c. The solution to the problem. What are your thoughts on that?
Maybe. I'm kind of losing faith in the Conservatives with every passing week. I mean, I never had an enormous amount of faith.
I'm talking about proper classical. I mean,
yeah,
proper sort of classical.
I understand. I mean, I've lost faith in the Conservative government for a long time, but Conservatives with a small c, I'm kind of losing faith in those as well, because they're not stepping up. They're not actually fighting the culture war in the way that they should. And I don't think they realise what's at stake in this conflict. What's at stake in this conflict, in my view, is a vision of Britain as a good country, fundamental traditional values, right from the idea that there are 2 sexes through to the idea that we should teach history in a particular way, through to the idea that it's a nice thing to fly the national flag. All of these things are under assault every day, and both big C and small c Conservatives are not really stepping up. I'm with George Orwell. In 1984, he said, "If there is hope, it lies with the proles." And I really do think that's true. And obviously, prole is an offensive word, but what it means is ordinary people. Ordinary people see through this stuff. And I think that's another thing that was positive about the Euro Championships. On the day of the final, we saw an ordinary working class rebellion against lockdown, against social distancing, and against the idea that we all have to clap along politely and bow down to Gareth Southgate. It was a very raucous, fun, social affair. And so that was a rebellious moment. And that's something that I think was quite positive.
Dominique, anything you want to challenge Brendan on, anything he's got wrong?
Well, for me personally, I think in this specific context of the knee taking, I kind of feel as though the whole culture wars conflict has kind of become really convoluted and really quite infantile, in my opinion. Because specifically when we were all clutching at our pearls and in a moral panic over knee taking.
Oh no, we've lost Dominique just when she's making the most brilliant point. We'll hopefully try and get her back, Brendan. But I just wanted to talk about Steve Baker, because he's a man I have great respect for, Brendan. And he said, we've lost Brendan too, but I'll come to you, Abby, on this, because Steve Baker, he actually said that the Conservative Party had got it all wrong on the taking of the knee. And he said that, in fact, the Conservative Party should never have endorsed this idea of booing taking the knee, and they should have actually embraced the act as a way of overcoming the culture war. What did you make of that?
Oh, I think that's a dreadful mistake of Steve Baker's story, with all due respect to him. No, embracing taking of the knee, which is associated with the Black Lives Matter organisation, I hasten to add, not the philosophy of Black Lives Matter, which I can think we all agree on. I mean, it's ridiculous to even be debating that. But the fact that it's associated with that organisation that ruined, set fire to parts of America, terrorised American citizens, to even think that we should be doing that in this country with, regardless of what anyone says, that is a link to that organisation, is just wrong. So Steve Baker's, I think he's wrong on that.
Amy
Totally.
McCall, where do you stand on the issue of taking the knee?
Well, I think that more people are familiar with the philosophy that you mentioned of the Black Lives Matter movement than the things that Abby mentioned and the political side of the movement. So it kind of reminds me when I got a triangle tattooed on my wrist and I thought it meant strength, and then I later found out it could mean that I'm a lesbian, because it's not what they originally intended. I think a lot of people still think that they only associate black taking with the philosophy, so they can't understand how anyone could take offence to that. And that's why it can be a real surprise, because they don't know that political side.
OK, well, Dominique and Brendan O'Neill are back with us. Dominique, you were making such a beautiful point, so can you finish it, please, because we lost you mid-flow.
Yeah, that was a shame. I was just saying that I think the whole culture war thing has kind of become a bit infantile now, and I think it's become like that on both sides of the debate. So, say for example, there was the whole thing about the footballers receiving racist comments, which are obviously disgusting, but we then found them to have come from, abroad mostly. And while we're all arguing about that and, clutching at our pearls over knee taking, MPs at that time also voted to make vaccines for care home staff mandatory. And I know from an article that you did, Brendan, that you were actually defending that. So I was just wondering where you came to that conclusion about the mandatory vaccination of care home staff.
Well, it's been an incredibly controversial article that I wrote. I've had so much blowback, you wouldn't believe it. I just think that there are certain care environments where it's legitimate to ask staff to do certain things. So, for example, if you're a nurse who works with people's blood, you're expected to be vaccinated against hepatitis B. If you work it for an abortion provider, there are certain immunizations you're expected to have, and so on and so forth. It is not uncommon to ask care workers and medical workers to have certain vaccinations. So, and I think the care home vaccination discussion has become a bit of a distraction, in my view, from the broader conversation we need to have about restoring freedom after the lockdown, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face at the moment. We've had an unprecedented suspension of civil liberty across society, and unless we have that broad conversation about the whole of society and the freedoms that need to be repaired, I think we're going to be in a bad way for a while.
But sorry, carry on, Dominique.
Yeah, I was just going to say, but surely mandatory vaccination is part of that wider framework of freedoms being taken away, because even in legislative terms in the UK, mandatory vaccination has always been something that was seen beyond the pale. I mean, Boris Johnson himself said that that's not the way that we do things here. And if we look at
it's a slippery slope, is your argument?
Yeah, it's a slippery slope. And even when you look at it in the context of the COVID vaccines, these are new vaccines, and this rule is being imposed upon care workers that are already in the job. So what that will mean is that they either take this injection that, is still in the trial phase. Of course, yes, it is effective, but there are still some concerns with that amongst care workers, or they lose their job. I mean, how isn't that a part of the broader framework of us losing our freedom? I
understand, and I'll just get Abby's point, and then you can respond to both, Brendan.
I literally, Dominique, took the words out of my mouth, not quite the same words, which is that bodily autonomy comes under civil liberties. So you can't really have one without the other, without getting into some weird philosophical...
Brendan O'Neill, final word to you on this.
I'm a huge supporter of bodily autonomy. That's why I'm pro-choice. I think bodily autonomy is the building block of freedom. But we do have to recognise the fact that in some settings there is sometimes a tension between one person's bodily autonomy and another's. And I think in care homes, the bodily integrity of the people who live there, who tend to be very vulnerable people, that does need to take precedence over the interests of everybody else. And I think care workers should be paid more. They should have far more respect in society. We've realised over the past year and a half just how central they are to the working of society. But in a care home, the needs of the residents have to take precedence over everything. That's my view.
OK, brilliant stuff. Brendan O'Neill, always a pleasure to have you on Uncancelled, and thank you to Abby Roberts, Dominique Samuels and Amy Nickel. Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.